On November 8, 2022, the World Gold Council released its quarterly report on central bank gold purchases. The numbers were stunning. In the third quarter of that year, central banks around the world had bought 399 tons of gold. It was the largest quarterly purchase on record. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that the buying accelerated in the fourth quarter. By the end of 2022, central banks had purchased over 1,100 tons of gold, more than any year since 1967. And the buying didn't stop. In 2023, they bought another 1,037 tons. In the first half of 2024, they bought 483 tons. The pattern was unmistakable. Central banks, the institutions that manage the world's currencies, that control monetary policy, that are supposed to believe in the power of paper money, were dumping their dollars, their euros, their bonds, and buying gold at a pace not seen in over half a century. This was not normal. This was not routine portfolio rebalancing. This was panic buying. And the question that no one in the mainstream financial media wanted to ask was simple. What do these central bankers know that they're not telling us? Why are the people who control the money system behaving like the money system is about to collapse? To understand why central banks are hoarding gold, you have to understand what gold represents. Gold is the ultimate store of value. It has been money for over 5,000 years, longer than any empire, any religion, any government. Empires rise and fall. Currencies come and go, but gold endures. It cannot be printed. It cannot be debased. It cannot be created by a government decree. There are only about 200,000 tons of gold that have ever been mined in all of human history. And the annual production is only about 3,000 tons, barely enough to increase the total supply by 1.5% per year. The scarcity is what gives gold its value. Unlike paper currencies, which governments can print in unlimited quantities, gold is constrained by geology and physics. You can't just decide to create more of it. You have to dig it out of the ground, 1 ounce at a time. And that takes time, labor, and capital. For most of the 20th century, this made gold the foundation of the international monetary system. Under the gold standard, currencies were backed by gold. A dollar was not just a piece of paper. It was a claim on a specific amount of gold held in a vault. This discipline prevented governments from printing too much money. If they did, their gold reserves would drain as people redeemed paper for metal. The gold standard constrained government power, and governments hated it. Between 1914 and 1971, the major powers gradually abandoned the gold standard. First during World War I, then during the Great Depression, and finally in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. The justification was always the same. Gold was a barbarous relic. It was an outdated constraint that prevented governments from managing the economy effectively. Paper money, controlled by wise central bankers, would be superior. It could be expanded during recessions to stimulate growth and contracted during booms to prevent inflation. It was scientific, modern, and flexible. Or so they claimed. For the first decade after 1971, the experiment seemed to fail spectacularly. The 1970s saw runaway inflation, oil shocks, and economic stagnation. The price of gold soared from $35 per ounce to over $800 by 1980. People were losing faith in paper money and fleeing to gold. But then Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, crushed inflation by raising interest rates to 20%. The economy plunged into recession, but inflation was broken. Confidence in the dollar was restored, and the price of gold collapsed, falling back to around $300 by the late 1990s. For 2 decades, from 1980 to 2000, gold was a terrible investment. It generated no income. It just sat there, inert. Meanwhile, stocks and bonds soared. The tech boom created fortunes. The end of the Cold War ushered in a period of American dominance and relative peace. This was called the Great Moderation, an era of stable growth, low inflation, and faith in central banks. Central bankers became celebrities. Alan Greenspan was praised as the maestro. The world believed that the problems of boom and bust had been solved, that wise technocrats could manage the economy perfectly using interest rates and money supply. Gold seemed irrelevant, a historical curiosity. Central banks reflected this confidence. They started selling their gold reserves. Britain famously sold half its gold between 1999 and 2002 at the bottom of the market, around $275 per ounce. The sales were announced in advance, depressing the price even further. It became known as the Brown Bottom, named after Gordon Brown, the chancellor who ordered the sales. Switzerland, the Netherlands, and other European countries also sold significant portions of their gold. The logic was simple. Why hold a non-yielding asset like gold when you could hold treasury bonds that pay interest? Gold was seen as a dead weight, a relic from a less enlightened era. But then everything changed. The 2008 financial crisis shattered the illusion. The Great Moderation was revealed as a fraud. The financial system, supposedly regulated by those wise central bankers, was built on fraud, leverage, and greed. When the housing bubble burst, the entire structure nearly collapsed. And how did the central banks respond? They printed money on a scale never seen before. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, they all engaged in quantitative easing, a euphemism for creating trillions of dollars, euros, pounds, and yen out of thin air. The money was used to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, to bail out banks, to prop up asset prices. It worked in the sense that it prevented a total collapse, but it also proved that the entire system was a confidence game. Money was being created at will, with no backing, no constraint, no anchor to reality, and gold noticed. The price of gold began to climb. In 2008, it was $800. By 2011, it reached $1,900. Central banks noticed too, but not the Western central banks. They were still selling or holding steady, still confident in their paper money system. It was the central banks of the developing world that started buying China, Russia, India, Turkey, Kazakhstan. These countries looked at what was happening in the West and drew a different conclusion. They saw the money printing, the bailouts, the quantitative easing, and they realized that Western currencies were being the dollar, the euro, the pound, they were all losing value in real terms. Even if the official inflation numbers didn't show it yet, these central banks decided they needed a hedge, an insurance policy against the collapse of the paper money system. And that insurance policy was gold. China was particularly aggressive. Starting around 2009, China began accumulating gold at an extraordinary pace. Officially, China reports holding about 2,264 tons of gold as of 2024. But almost no one believes this number. China is notoriously secretive about its gold holdings. It only updates the figure sporadically, and when it does, the updates reveal purchases that had been hidden for years. Independent analysts believe China holds anywhere from 4,000 to 10,000 tons of gold. The reason for the secrecy is strategic. If China announced it was buying massive amounts of gold, the price would spike, making further purchases more expensive. So they buy quietly, through covert channels, through domestic production that never leaves the country, through private imports that don't show up in official statistics. Why is China so obsessed with gold? Because China has a long historical memory. They remember the century of humiliation, when Western powers imposed unequal treaties on China, when foreign banks controlled Chinese finance, when China was weak and exploited. They are determined never to be in that position again, and they understand that financial power is the foundation of geopolitical power. China holds over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, mostly in dollars and dollar-denominated assets like treasury bonds. This makes China vulnerable. If the dollar collapses, if America defaults, if tensions escalate and America freezes Chinese assets, China's reserves could be wiped out. Gold is the hedge against this risk. Gold cannot be frozen by a foreign government. It cannot be printed away. It cannot be sanctioned. It is sovereign wealth in the truest sense. Russia learned this lesson the hard way. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the West imposed sanctions. Russian banks were cut off from dollar financing. Russian officials were banned from traveling to Europe and America. The message was clear. If you hold your wealth in dollars or in Western financial institutions, you are vulnerable. Russia's central bank, led by Elvira Nabiullina, responded by going on a gold buying spree. Between 2014 and 2022, Russia increased its gold reserves from about 1,000 tons to over 2,300 tons. At the same time, Russia was selling its treasury bonds, reducing its holdings from over $130 billion in 2013 to almost zero by 2018. Russia was deliberately moving its reserves out of assets that could be seized and into assets that were sovereign. The strategy seemed vindicated in 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, The West imposed the most comprehensive sanctions in history. They froze over $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western banks. They cut Russian banks off from SWIFT. They seized the assets of Russian oligarchs. It was financial warfare on a scale never seen before. But Russia's gold, the 2,300 tons sitting in vaults in Moscow, could not be touched. It was beyond the reach of Western sanctions, and in the aftermath of the invasion, Russia used that gold to stabilize the ruble, to settle trade with countries that would still do business with them, to maintain some measure of financial sovereignty. The rest of the world watched the freezing of Russian reserves with alarm. If America and Europe were willing to freeze the reserves of a nuclear-armed great power, what would stop them from doing the same to anyone else? The answer was nothing. The weaponization of the dollar and the euro had revealed that holding reserves in Western currencies and Western banks was not safe. It was a political risk. Your wealth could be confiscated if you ran afoul of Washington or Brussels. This realization triggered a stampede. Central banks around the world began buying gold and reducing their dollar holdings. Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore, Thailand, Egypt, Qatar, Iraq, the list goes on. Even countries that were supposedly American allies were buying gold. In 2022 and 2023, the buying reached a fever pitch. The central banks were not just diversifying, they were fleeing. They were moving their reserves out of the dollar system as fast as they could without causing a panic. And they were putting that money into gold because gold is the only asset that is truly neutral, that belongs to no country, that cannot be weaponized by a hostile power. This is the first reason central banks are hoarding gold. They have lost trust in the dollar system. They have seen that dollars can be frozen, that SWIFT access can be revoked, that financial assets held in the West can be seized, and they are taking precautions. But there is a second reason, one that is even more ominous. Central banks are buying gold because they see what is coming. They see the debt levels, they see the deficits, they see the money printing, and they know it cannot continue. The numbers are staggering. The United States has over $34 trillion in national debt. That is more than 120% of GDP. The annual deficit is over $1.5 trillion. Just the interest on the debt is now approaching $1 trillion per year, and it is growing. As old bonds mature and are replaced with new bonds at higher interest rates, the interest expense will balloon. Within a few years, interest payments could be the largest single line item in the federal budget, larger than defense, larger than Social Security, and there is no plan to fix it. Neither political party is willing to cut spending or raise taxes enough to balance the budget. The Republicans want tax cuts and military spending. The Democrats want social programs and infrastructure. Both want to avoid hard choices. So the deficits continue, the debt grows, and the problem gets worse. The only way the U.S. government can finance these deficits is by selling bonds. And the only way to sell trillions of dollars in bonds every year is if someone is willing to buy them. For decades, foreign central banks were the buyers. China, Japan, and Europe bought treasuries with their trade surplus dollars, but they are not buying anymore. In fact, they are selling. China has reduced its treasury holdings from over $1.3 trillion in 2030 to under $800 billion in 2024. Japan is also selling to defend the yen. European central banks are reducing their dollar reserves. The buyers are disappearing. So who is buying? The Federal Reserve, through quantitative easing, the Fed prints money and buys treasury bonds. It is monetizing the debt, a process that has destroyed currencies throughout history. Weimar Germany did it and got hyperinflation. Zimbabwe did it and destroyed their currency. Venezuela did it and created an economic catastrophe. America is doing it on a much larger scale, but so far has avoided those outcomes because the dollar is the global reserve currency. The world still needs dollars for trade, so there is demand that absorbs the newly printed money, but that demand is not infinite, and it is declining. As the dollar is weaponized, as alternatives emerge, as trust erodes, the demand for dollars is shrinking. And when demand shrinks but supply keeps growing, the value falls. This is basic economics. Central banks understand this. They see the trajectory. They know that the dollar is being debased slowly but inevitably. The purchasing power of the dollar is being eroded by money printing. The official inflation numbers might say 3% or 4%, but the real inflation, the inflation in food, energy, housing, healthcare, is much higher. And it is going to get worse because the US government cannot stop running deficits. It is politically impossible, and the Federal Reserve cannot stop printing money to finance those deficits. It is economically impossible. The debt spiral is locked in, and the end game is either default or inflation. Those are the only two ways out. Default is unthinkable. It would destroy the credibility of US Treasury bonds, the foundation of the global financial system. It would trigger a worldwide depression. So default will be avoided at all costs, which means the only option is inflation. The debt will be inflated away. The government will print money until the real value of the debt is reduced. A dollar of debt owed today will be repaid with a dollar that is worth much less in the future. It is a slow-motion default, a stealth confiscation of wealth from savers and creditors. And central banks know this is coming. So they are buying gold. Gold is the classic inflation hedge. When paper money loses value, gold holds its value. This has been true for thousands of years. In Weimar Germany, people who held gold survived. People who held marks were wiped out. In Zimbabwe, gold held its value. The Zimbabwe dollar became worthless. Throughout history, the pattern repeats. Paper money is devalued. Gold endures. Central banks are preparing for this future. They are quietly, without announcing it, without causing panic, moving their reserves out of dollars and into gold. They are building a lifeboat before the ship sinks, and they are doing it at the fastest pace in over 50 years because they see the iceberg approaching. But there is a third reason, one that is rarely discussed but might be the most important. Central banks are buying gold because they are preparing for a reset of the international monetary system. The current system, the dollar-based fiat currency system that has existed since 1971, is breaking down. It is unsustainable. The imbalances are too large, the debt is too high, the trust is too low, the alternatives are too developed, something has to give, and when it does, the world will need a new monetary system. History shows that monetary systems change every few decades. The classical gold standard lasted from the 1870s to 1914. The interwar period was chaos. Bretton Woods lasted from 1944 to 1971. The current dollar system has lasted since 1971, over 50 years. It is overdue for a change, and the signs of change are everywhere. It would be backed by a basket of commodities, including gold. It would allow member countries to trade without using dollars. It would create an alternative to SWIFT for payments. It would be the foundation of a parallel financial system. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is official policy being discussed at the highest levels. The BRICS nations represent nearly half the world's population and a growing share of global GDP. If they succeed in creating a viable alternative to the dollar, the entire balance of power shifts, and gold would likely be at the center of that new system. Why? Because gold is the only asset that everyone trusts. China doesn't trust dollars because America controls them. America doesn't trust yuan because China controls them. Europe doesn't trust either, but everyone trusts gold. Gold is neutral. It belongs to no country. It cannot be manipulated by any government. It is the only possible foundation for a truly international monetary system that is not controlled by one country. So the central banks are accumulating gold in preparation for this transition. When the new system is negotiated, the countries with the most gold will have the most influence. They will be able to demand better terms. They will be in a stronger bargaining position. This is why China is buying in secret. They want to accumulate as much as possible before the transition happens. They want to be the dominant player in the new system. Russia's doing the same. India's doing the same. Even countries like Poland and Hungary, EU members, are massively increasing their gold reserves. Poland has tripled its gold holdings in the past few years. These are not coincidences. These are strategic decisions based on a shared understanding that the current system is ending and a new one is being born. The Western central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, they are not buying gold. They are still sitting on their existing reserves, but not adding to them significantly. This might seem strange. If gold is so important, why aren't the Western central banks buying? The answer is that they are trapped. If the Federal Reserve started buying large amounts of gold, It would send a signal to the markets that the Fed has lost confidence in the dollar. It would trigger a panic. The dollar would plunge. Treasury yields would spike. The financial system would so the Fed cannot buy gold openly without causing the very crisis they are trying to avoid. They are trapped by their own propaganda. For decades, they have told the world that gold is irrelevant, that paper money managed by central banks is superior, that the dollar is as good as gold. They cannot now reverse that message without admitting they were wrong. But their silence is telling. While the Fed is not buying, the US government has made no effort to sell its gold either. America still holds over 8,100 tons of gold, the largest official reserve in the world. And despite chronic deficits, despite desperate need for revenue, the government has never seriously considered selling that gold. Why? Because they know it is the ultimate insurance policy. When everything else fails, when the dollar is no longer accepted, when treasury bonds are no longer trusted, America will still have its gold, and gold will still have value. The central banks of the world are engaged in a silent gold war. They are competing to accumulate as much as possible before the music stops. The countries that have the most gold when the current system collapses will be in the strongest position when the new system is built. The countries that hold only paper will be at the mercy of those who hold metal. This is why the buying has accelerated. This is why the numbers are breaking records. This is why central banks are acting like the world is ending. Because, in a sense, it is the world as we have known it. The dollar-dominated American-led financial system is ending. It is being replaced by something multipolar, something more balanced, something where gold plays a central role again. The central bankers know this. They see the data. They run the models. They understand the mathematics of debt and deficits. They know what is coming, but they cannot say it publicly. Central bankers are supposed to project confidence. They are supposed to reassure the markets. They are supposed to claim that everything is under control. So they smile, they give speeches about inflation targets and economic growth. They insist that the system is sound. But behind the scenes, they are buying gold. Their actions betray their words. And anyone paying attention can see the truth. When the people in charge of the money system are desperately accumulating the one asset that is not part of the money system, it tells you everything you need to know about their confidence in that system. The final piece of the puzzle is the public. While central banks are hoarding gold, the general public in the West is largely oblivious. Most people in America and Europe do not own any gold. They have their wealth in bank accounts, in stocks, in bonds, in real estate, all denominated in paper currencies. They trust that the system is stable, that their savings are safe, that the government and the central banks are looking out for them, but that trust is misplaced. The government is not looking out for them. The government is looking out for itself, trying to finance its deficits by any means necessary. The central banks are not looking out for them. The central banks are looking out for the financial system, bailing out banks and protecting asset prices. The small saver, the middle-class worker, the retiree on a fixed income, they are the ones who will pay the price when the inflation comes. Their savings will be eroded, their purchasing power will collapse, and they will have no hedge, no protection, because they were never told to prepare. Meanwhile, the elites, the central bankers, the wealthy, they are protected. They own real assets, they own gold, they own foreign property, they own businesses, they are diversified, they will survive the transition. The wealth gap will widen even further. This is not a conspiracy. This is simply the logic of a system where money can be printed, but real assets are finite. Those who own the real assets will preserve their wealth. Those who own only paper will lose, and the central banks, by hoarding gold, are showing which category they believe is safe. The question for anyone reading this is simple. Do you trust the central banks when they speak? Or do you trust them when they act? Their words say everything is fine. Their actions say prepare for catastrophe. They are buying gold at the fastest pace in over 50 years. They are diversifying out of dollars. They are building alternative payment systems. They are preparing for a new monetary order. They are doing all of this while telling the public that everything is under control, that inflation is transitory, that the debt is manageable, that the dollar is strong. The contradiction is glaring, and the conclusion is unavoidable. The central bankers are preparing for a crisis that they will not admit is coming. They are hoarding gold like the world is ending, because In a financial sense, the world as we have known it is ending. The dollar era is closing. The fiat currency experiment is failing. The debt bubble is reaching its limit. And gold, the ancient store of value that has survived every empire and every currency collapse in history, is reasserting itself as the ultimate form of money. The central banks see this. The question is, will you? I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.